Emma had always been the kind of woman who drew lines around her life. Not just lines, but walls, solid, carefully built, and guarded with quiet determination. She wasn't cold, and she wasn't distant by nature. In fact, she was warm, friendly, and carried a laugh that made people want to stay close to her. But when it came to her heart, she had rules she had made after watching her friends fall apart over broken relationships, after seeing her own mother struggle when love went wrong. Emma promised herself she would never let feelings interfere with her work, never let attraction lead her into something she couldn't handle, and never, under any circumstances, blur the line between friendship and something more. She believed in control. She believed in discipline. And for a long time, that belief had kept her steady. She had a routine. She worked hard. She spent her weekends hiking in the nearby hills. She had dinner with friends. And she smiled politely when strangers tried to get closer. Her life wasn't dull. It was safe, predictable, clean. And she told herself that was enough. Everything changed the morning Daniel walked into her office. Emma remembered it clearly. The glass door opened, and a tall man with calm eyes and a quiet, self-assured presence stepped in. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the type who filled the room with unnecessary energy. But something about him carried weight, the kind of weight that made people notice even when he said nothing. His hair was slightly grayed at the temples, his suit pressed but not flashy, and when he introduced himself, his voice was low and steady. "Daniel Wright," he said with a handshake that was firm but warm. Emma responded with her usual professional smile. "Emma Carter, welcome." She didn't know what it was exactly. Maybe the way his eyes lingered just long enough to show he was listening. Maybe the way his laughter slipped out naturally during that first team meeting. But from the start, he felt different. She caught herself noticing him. Not in the careless way she might notice someone passing on the street, but in a way that unsettled her balance. Still, she reminded herself of her rules. He was a colleague. He was part of her professional world. She wouldn't, let anything shift the boundaries she had lived by for so long. She told herself it was harmless, the way her chest lifted when he walked into the break room, or how she found herself listening more closely when he spoke. Admiration is not attraction, she reasoned. Respect is not love. But slowly, without her permission, her walls began to shake. It was the little things that started to break through. Like the way Daniel remembered her coffee order after only 2 mornings. Or the way he noticed details most people ignored. How he once asked if she was okay after a long meeting, simply because he caught a hint of tiredness in her eyes. He wasn't overly charming, not in the obvious sense. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't push. He simply carried himself with quiet confidence. And in that quietness, Emma felt something stir inside her she hadn't felt in years. She tried to ignore it. She filled her schedule, stayed later at her desk, and reminded herself of the dangers of slipping. She even repeated her mantra in her head, "Boundaries keep me safe." But every time she caught his gaze across the table, she felt her heart trip over itself in a way rules could not control. Emma thought about her life before Daniel's arrival. It had been structured, organized, and comfortable. She thought she had everything under control. But now control didn't feel as satisfying as it once had. She found herself glancing at the clock during meetings. Not because she wanted the day to end, but because she wondered if she might run into him by the elevators. She found herself choosing her words more carefully when speaking to him, not because she needed to, but because his opinion mattered in a way that unsettled her. It wasn't just attraction. It was the feeling of being seen. One afternoon, while gathering papers in the conference room, Emma noticed him watching her with a thoughtful expression. Not inappropriate, not heavy, just observant, almost as if he was trying to understand her without needing to ask questions. Their eyes met, and in that split second, Emma felt the air shift. It was so brief, so subtle, yet so powerful, that she had to turn away quickly, hiding the flush rising to her cheeks. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked casually, his voice smooth, giving nothing away. "Yes," she answered too quickly. "Just fine." She busied herself with the papers, arranging them neatly into a stack that didn't really need arranging. And while her hands moved, her mind raced. Why did his attention affect her like this? Why did his presence feel like both a comfort and a risk? Emma went home that night unsettled. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, brushing her hair, trying to steady her thoughts. "You know better," she whispered to herself. She thought of her rules again, her precious rules that had guided her for so long. Rules that had protected her heart from chaos. Rules that had kept her path clear and focused. But deep inside, a small voice asked the question she didn't want to hear. What if those rules are the very thing keeping you from something real? She silenced that voice quickly, shaking her head, turning off the light. But even as she lay in bed, her mind returned to Daniel's smile, his eyes, the sound of his laugh. She hated that her thoughts drifted toward him without permission. She hated that her heart didn't follow the same discipline her mind tried to enforce. Emma had built her life on boundaries. They had been her shield, her armor, her safety net. But now, for the first time, she wondered what it would feel like to let someone close enough to break them. And that question lingered in her chest. Soft but persistent, as if the answer was waiting just beyond the horizon of tomorrow. The office was quiet that evening, quieter than Emma had ever heard it. Most of the staff had already left, leaving behind the faint hum of the heating system and the soft glow of computer screens waiting to be shut down. The sky outside had turned a deep navy, and the glass windows reflected the empty chairs like a mirror of silence. Emma sat at her desk, typing quickly, determined to finish a report before morning. She told herself she liked staying late. She told herself it was about discipline. But the truth was, staying busy meant she didn't have to deal with the thoughts that had followed her home for weeks. Thoughts of Daniel. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice when he walked back into the office. His footsteps were steady, unhurried, but when he spoke, his voice startled her. "Still here?" Emma looked up, heart leaping in her chest. Daniel stood near the doorway, jacket slung over his arm, his tie loosened as if he had already decided to call it a night. He looked at her with that calm expression, the one that always seemed to carry more than words. "I just need to finish this section," she said quickly, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. "I'll be out soon." He stepped closer, leaning casually against the edge of her desk. "You know, reports don't disappear if you leave them for the morning. They'll wait for you." Emma smiled faintly, eyes dropping back to her screen. "I know, but I prefer to get things done now." Daniel studied her for a moment. "Then I'll stay too. No one should be the last one here alone." Her breath caught. She wanted to protest, to say there was no need, but his tone left no room for argument. He wasn't offering out of obligation, he meant it. And against her better judgment, she didn't tell him no. The room grew heavier with quiet as minutes turned into an hour. The sound of her typing and the occasional scratch of his pen filled the space between them. At first, Emma tried to stay focused, eyes locked on her screen, but the awareness of his presence pressed in from every angle. She could feel him there without looking, calm, steady, solid. Then it happened. They both reached for the same document that had slid halfway off the desk. Her hand landed on the page at the same moment his did. Skin touched skin, fingers brushing for less than a second, yet long enough to send a sudden warmth shooting through her arm. Emma froze. The world seemed to stop. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't look away. "Sorry," she whispered, pulling back so quickly the paper crinkled in her hands. Her cheeks burned. Daniel didn't move for a moment. His eyes lingered on her, not intense, not heavy, but searching, as if he had felt it too. Then he smiled softly, almost as though he understood something she wasn't ready to say aloud. "No need to be sorry," he replied quietly. Emma tried to return to her work, but her hands trembled slightly on the keyboard. That single touch, innocent as it was, had undone weeks of discipline. It wasn't about attraction anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about how her body reacted before her mind could stop it, how her heart skipped as if it had been waiting for that moment. The silence between them shifted. It wasn't the same calm quiet from before. It was charged now, alive with something unspoken. Emma felt it in the way she avoided his gaze, in the way every movement of his hand near the desk made her hyper-aware of the space between them. She tried to ground herself, It was nothing, she told herself. Just an accident. But deep inside, she knew that wasn't true. That brief touch had pulled down one of her carefully built walls, and she couldn't put it back the same way. At last, Daniel broke the silence with a light laugh. You work too hard, Emma. You need balance. She glanced at him, forcing a smile. Says the man staying late just to keep me company? Touché, he said, his smile widening just enough to make her heart stumble again. They finished the night in half-hearted productivity, both pretending to be focused, though Emma knew neither of them really was. Every small movement, every glance, every pause felt heavy with the awareness of what had just happened. When they finally packed their things, Daniel walked her to the elevator. The hallway lights flickered softly overhead, casting long shadows on the floor. They stood side by side, waiting for the doors to open, the silence stretching between them once more. Emma kept her eyes forward, determined not to meet his gaze. She didn't trust herself. She didn't trust the way her chest tightened or how her breath caught when he stood too close. As the elevator doors slid open, Daniel stepped aside, letting her go first. She murmured a thank you, but before she could step in, his voice stopped her. Emma, he said gently. She turned, her pulse racing. For a moment, he didn't speak. His eyes met hers, steady, calm, yet carrying something that made her chest ache. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a confession. It was something quieter, something waiting. Yes? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shook his head lightly, as if dismissing his own thought. Never mind. Good night. The doors closed between them, but Emma carried the weight of his gaze all the way home. That night, as she lay awake, the memory of his touch lingered on her skin. It was such a small thing, just fingertips brushing, but it had changed something inside her. She had built her life on boundaries, on rules that kept her safe. Yet one accidental moment with him had made those rules feel fragile, almost meaningless. Emma closed her eyes, telling herself it didn't matter. She told herself she could still pull back, still build the walls higher. But even as she repeated the words, she knew the truth. Something had shifted, and there was no undoing it, and deep down, she was terrified, and alive, in a way she hadn't felt in years. Emma told herself she needed space. After that night in the office, after the touch that wouldn't leave her mind, she made a decision. Distance was the only way to keep control. She had built her life on boundaries, and she wasn't about to let one mistake undo her discipline. The next morning, she arrived at work earlier than usual, slipping into her office before anyone else came in. She kept her head down in meetings, spoke only when necessary, and avoided the break room during coffee hours. If she saw Daniel approaching, she found a reason to turn the other way. It wasn't that she disliked him, quite the opposite. But the closer she let herself get, the harder it became to protect the walls she had spent years building. At first, she thought she was doing well. She convinced herself that by keeping conversations brief and interactions professional, she was regaining balance. But it didn't take long for Daniel to notice. One afternoon, when the team was wrapping up a project, he caught her just as she was gathering her things. His voice was gentle but steady. Emma, did I do something wrong? The question hit harder than she expected. She looked up at him, startled, and for a moment all she could do was stare. His eyes were calm, searching, but not accusing. He wasn't upset, he was simply concerned. No, she said quickly, forcing a small smile. You didn't do anything wrong. He tilted his head, studying her. Then why does it feel like you're avoiding me? Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to lie, to brush it off with some excuse about work or deadlines, but she couldn't. Not when his eyes were on her like that, steady, patient, waiting. It's not you, she finally admitted, her voice softer now. It's me, I have rules, boundaries I try to keep. It's easier that way. Daniel didn't push. He nodded slowly, accepting her words with a quiet respect. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something that said he understood more than she was willing to say. All right, he replied simply. if that's what you need." His tone wasn't cold, but it carried a weight that settled deep in her chest. Emma nodded, grateful he didn't press further, yet the moment he walked away, she felt a sharp ache she hadn't expected. She thought distance would give her peace, but instead, it left her with a hollow emptiness she couldn't shake. The days that followed were harder. She stuck to her decision, keeping things professional and distant. But in doing so, she began to notice the little ways his absence affected her. Coffee breaks weren't the same without his quiet humor. Meetings felt longer without his calm interjections. Even the office itself seemed emptier, as if the air carried less warmth when she tried to push him away. What unsettled her most was how much she missed his presence. She had convinced herself that avoiding him would make things easier, but all it did was remind her how much space he had quietly taken in her life. One morning, she found herself standing outside the building, staring at the glass doors before walking in. Her chest felt tight, her thoughts tangled. She didn't want to admit it, but the truth pressed in on her. She wasn't avoiding him for her own safety anymore. She was avoiding him because she was afraid of what it meant if she didn't. That realization followed her into the office, into every glance she stole when she thought no one was watching. Daniel never called her out again. He didn't demand her attention, didn't push her to explain, but he noticed. She could feel it in the quiet way his eyes lingered when they crossed paths, in the way his smile softened whenever she entered the room. He wasn't angry, he was simply waiting, and that patience made it even harder. One late afternoon, Emma was sorting through papers in the copy room when she heard the door open. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. His presence filled the room in a way that was unmistakable, steady, quiet, grounding. "I'm not here to bother you," he said, his voice gentle. "Just need the printer." Emma nodded quickly, keeping her eyes on the stack of papers in her hands. But the silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. She could feel his eyes on her, though she refused to look. Finally, he spoke again. "Emma, you don't have to explain yourself, but I just want you to know. You don't need to keep walls up with me. I'd never cross a line you didn't want me to." Her hands stilled. She swallowed hard, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his words. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. He meant it. Every word. His expression was calm, steady, without a trace of expectation. He wasn't trying to break her rules. He was telling her he respected them. Something inside her cracked at that. For so long, she had convinced herself that boundaries were protection, that rules were the only way to keep her heart safe. But looking at him now, she realized the truth. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of herself, of the way her heart betrayed her every time he was near. Emma took a slow breath, then forced herself to speak. "I know you wouldn't. I don't trust myself sometimes." The honesty surprised even her. It slipped out before she could stop it, raw and unpolished. But Daniel didn't flinch. He only nodded, his eyes softening. "Then trust this," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, it doesn't have to be complicated." Emma couldn't find the words to reply. She wanted to argue, to insist it wasn't that simple, but the weight of his gaze silenced her. Later that night, as she lay awake in bed, the memory of his words echoed in her mind. It doesn't have to be complicated. She replayed them over and over, feeling both comforted and unsettled. Because deep down, she knew he was right. It wasn't complicated at all. She was the one making it complicated, clinging to rules that no longer held the same strength. And as much as she tried to deny it, Emma realized something she couldn't ignore anymore. The distance she thought she needed was only making her want him more. The first cold rains of autumn swept across the city, turning streets into shining rivers of light. People hurried under umbrellas, coats pulled tight, faces hidden from the storm. Emma stood at the front doors of the office building, clutching her bag, staring at the sheets of rain falling in relentless waves. She had forgotten her umbrella, and the thought of running through the storm left her frozen. For a moment, she considered waiting it out, but the storm didn't look like it was leaving anytime soon. She sighed, hugging her bag close, when suddenly, A shadow moved beside her. "Looks like you're stuck," Daniel said, unfolding his umbrella with a practiced flick. His voice carried warmth that cut through the cold air. Emma turned, startled. He stood so close she could smell the faint scent of rain already clinging to his coat. The umbrella arched above them, wide enough for two. "You don't have one?" he asked gently. She shook her head, embarrassed. "I didn't think it would rain this hard." "Come on then," he said simply, stepping closer and angling the umbrella so it covered her too. "I'll walk you." Her chest tightened. She hesitated, just for a breath, then stepped under the umbrella with him. The world outside was chaotic, the roar of rain, the hiss of tires on wet pavement. But inside that small circle of space, everything felt still. His shoulder brushed hers as they moved in step, and though she tried to focus on the streets, the buildings, the storm, her awareness stayed locked on him. The sidewalk was crowded with people rushing, umbrellas bumping into each other. Daniel shifted slightly, guiding her closer to him, his arm brushing against hers again. It wasn't intentional, not deliberate, but it sent a rush through her body she couldn't hide. Neither of them spoke for a while. Their silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy with something unspoken. Emma tried to steady her breath, but every time their hands swung close, every time his coat brushed against her sleeve, her resolve weakened. Halfway down the block, a gust of wind blew, forcing them closer under the umbrella. Emma reached instinctively, her hand brushing against his. She meant to pull away quickly, but this time, she didn't. Daniel's hand lingered near hers, uncertain, waiting. He didn't grip, didn't push, just let his fingers lightly touch hers, as if giving her the choice. And Emma, without thinking, without planning, let her hand stay there. The moment was small, barely noticeable to the rushing crowd around them. But to Emma, it was everything. A warmth spread through her chest, melting the cold edges of her rules. It wasn't a bold gesture, it wasn't a declaration, it was a simple touch, yet it carried a weight no words could hold. Her heart raced, but she didn't pull away. She let herself feel it, the safety, the steadiness, the quiet connection that had been building for weeks. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't dangerous. It was something real, something she couldn't deny anymore. Daniel glanced at her, his eyes soft, questioning, but not demanding. His expression said everything. "I'm here, if you want this." Emma met his gaze for only a second before looking away, her breath catching. She didn't need to speak. Her silence, the way she didn't move her hand, was answer enough. They walked, the rest of the way like that, their hands barely touching, fingers brushing lightly. Yet the connection between them felt stronger than anything she had allowed herself before. The storm raged around them, but inside that small space under his umbrella, Emma felt a calm she hadn't known she was missing. When they reached her street, Daniel stopped at the corner. The rain still fell hard, bouncing off the umbrella, trickling down their coats. He didn't step away immediately. Instead, he stood there, his hand still near hers, his eyes holding hers with quiet patience. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the rain. Emma swallowed, her heart heavy with everything she wanted to say, but couldn't. "Thank you for walking me." He gave a small nod, his lips curving in the faintest smile. "Anytime." The moment stretched, fragile, waiting for something more. But neither of them moved. Then slowly he stepped back, lowering the umbrella just enough to hand it to her. "Keep it," he said. "Looks like you need it more than I do." She hesitated, then took it, their fingers brushing once more in the exchange. The contact was brief, but it left her breathless. "Good night, Emma," he said, his tone gentle, final. She nodded, clutching the umbrella, watching as he walked back into the rain. His figure blurred in the storm, disappearing into the gray night. but the echo of his touch stayed with her. When Emma entered her apartment, dripping with the memory of rain and warmth, she set the umbrella by the door and stood still for a long time. She touched her hand, the one that had brushed against his, and felt her chest tighten. She had promised herself she wouldn't cross lines, that she would never let her heart wander where it wasn't safe. But tonight, under a storm, with nothing more than a hand brushing against hers, she had broken that promise. And strangely, she didn't feel regret. She felt alive. As she changed into dry clothes and curled up by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass, she knew something had shifted permanently. Rules had guided her for so long, but tonight proved they weren't enough to stop her heart. She had spent years building walls, convincing herself they kept her safe. But one simple touch from Daniel had shown her a truth she could no longer ignore. Sometimes walls don't protect you. Sometimes they just keep you from feeling what it means to truly live. The storm outside raged on, but inside, Emma felt a calm she hadn't known before. A dangerous calm, yes, because it meant she was letting go. But it was also beautiful, because for the first time, she didn't feel alone in the storm. Emma didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed listening to the steady rhythm of rain against her window, but all she could feel was the echo of Daniel's touch on her hand. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the steady way he had looked at her under the umbrella, the quiet patience in his eyes, the way he hadn't forced anything, yet had left her with a storm raging inside. She had crossed a line, though no one else would have seen it that way. It was just a touch, just fingers brushing in the rain. But for Emma, it was the moment her walls finally fell. For years, she had believed boundaries were protection, that they kept her safe from heartbreak and disappointment. Now she wasn't so sure. What she felt wasn't danger. It was life, real and undeniable, and she didn't know how to ignore it anymore. Morning came quickly. She sat at the edge of her bed, tired but restless, staring at the umbrella leaning by her door. It wasn't just an umbrella. It was proof of what she had felt, of the choice waiting for her. She could either return to her old rules, rebuild her walls, pretend nothing had changed, or she could take a step she had never allowed herself before. By the time she walked into the office, she still hadn't decided. She told herself she would focus on work, bury the memory, and carry on like before. But when she stepped into the hallway and saw Daniel standing by her desk, everything she had rehearsed in her head disappeared. He wasn't waiting with a question, or a demand, or even a smile that asked for too much. He simply stood there, coffee in hand, as if he'd been waiting only to make sure she arrived safely. When their eyes met, he gave her the smallest nod, calm and steady, the kind of gesture that said, "I'm here." No rush, no pressure. Emma's breath caught. She froze in place for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. She realized then that he wasn't going to make the choice for her. He wasn't going to cross lines or push her past her limits. The choice had always been hers. The day went on as usual. Meetings, phone calls, endless emails. But nothing about it felt normal. Every time she passed him in the hallway, every time she caught the sound of his laugh from across the office, her chest tightened with the weight of her decision. By late afternoon, she couldn't focus at all. Her hands shook slightly as she typed, her thoughts tangled, her heart louder than logic. When most of the office had cleared out, she finally gathered the courage to act. She stood by her desk, staring at the papers she pretended to organize when she heard his footsteps approaching. He stopped nearby, his presence as grounding as ever. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emma turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "I've been running from something. From you. From me." Daniel didn't interrupt. He waited, calm, steady, his expression soft. "I told myself I needed rules," she continued, her hands tightening on the folder she held. That boundaries would keep me safe. But the truth is, I'm just scared. Scared of feeling too much. Scared of getting hurt. And every time you're near, I feel like I'm losing control of the life I built for myself. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her words rushing out faster than she intended. She waited for him to answer, to reassure her, to tell her what to do. But instead, he stayed quiet, giving her the space to finish. Emma swallowed hard. Last night, when you walked me home, I didn't want to let go. And that terrifies me more than anything. Daniel set down his coffee on the corner of her desk. His eyes never left hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of certainty. Emma, he said, you don't need to fight yourself with me. I don't want to break your rules. I just want to be here, however you'll let me. That's enough. Her throat tightened at the sincerity in his words. There was no demand, no pressure, no attempt to pull her where she wasn't ready to go. He was simply offering himself, steady, patient, real. And in that moment, Emma realized she had been wrong about boundaries all along. They hadn't been protecting her. They had been keeping her from this, from someone who didn't want to tear her walls down, but wanted to stand beside her, whether the walls were there or not. She took a deep breath, her decision settling in her chest like a weight finally lifted. Slowly, she stepped closer to him, close enough that her silence carried meaning. She didn't need grand gestures or carefully chosen words. She just needed to stand there, letting her actions say what her heart had been trying to tell her for weeks. Daniel didn't move at first. He searched her face, making sure this was her choice, her step. And when he saw the answer in her eyes, his expression softened into the kind of smile she knew she'd never forget. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. That night when Emma returned home, the rain had stopped. The streets were quiet, washed clean by the storm. She placed the umbrella by the door once more, but this time, it didn't feel like a symbol of fear or hesitation. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Emma knew the future was uncertain. She knew there would be challenges, risks, moments where her old fears might try to return. But as she thought of Daniel's words, of the patience in his eyes and the steadiness of his presence, she understood something new. She didn't have to fight alone anymore. Boundaries had kept her safe for so long. But his touch, gentle, patient, unspoken, had shown her something far greater. Not danger, not recklessness, but the possibility of love. And for the first time in years, Emma was ready to choose it.